Is Kristen left? I think so.
Well, I'm going to start just with introductory remarks. So welcome everyone to this edition of PHS Live. I'm very happy to have this conversation with Hispanic and Latinx Mid-Council leaders. We do have interpretation available, so there's some instructions going out in the chat about that. I encourage you during the webinar to put questions in the Q&A feature of Zoom webinar, although Natalie Schulstedt, my colleague, is also going to be monitoring the chat. And we do hope to have about 10 to 15 minutes at the end of the hour for questions from the audience. I am so happy to have the 5 panelists here, and rather than me introduce them, they have agreed to introduce themselves. So I would ask you all to do that, to say a little bit about your background, where you're currently geographically located, where your ministry is, and why you were called to that ministry. And Ruth, will you start?
Sure. Thank you so very much, Nancy, for hosting my esteemed colleagues and friends and myself today. I'm Ruth Faith Santana-Grace. I am Minister of Word and Sacrament, serving as Executive Presbyter at the Presbytery of Philadelphia. I am a child of this denomination, a PK, a Presbyterian, a pastor's kid. So my faults are all coming from this denominational background. I am what is known as a New Eurekan, which is someone of Puerto Rican heritage, born and raised in New York City. I have served, I grew up in the Spanish language church for the first 18 years of my life, then did my meandering as good 18 to 25-year-olds do, landed in an Anglo church later on, went into ministry as a second career person, spent 13 years in the large church and the last 17 years in mid-council ministry. The reason I'm here is because God has called me kicking and screaming into this ministry when I realized I may not get the kind of ministry I really thought I wanted to be in because of the biases and limitations of our denominational profile. That's me in a 3-minute soundbite.
So I'm just going to go around my screen. Eliana, you're next.
Thanks, Nancy. Hello, everyone. My name is Eliana Maxim, and I am also a Minister of Word and Sacrament. I am actually Barranquillera, which means I was born in Barranquilla in the country of Colombia. Came here as a child, have gone back and forth quite a bit, living here and living there, as many immigrants tend to do. I grew up Roman Catholic, heard about Presbyterians, but did not choose to become a Presbyterian until about 26 years ago. I'm currently serving as the co-executive presbyter of the Presbytery of Seattle. And I believe that I stumbled into ministry as a second career because I have, besides a deep love for God, I've discovered that I actually have a deep love for people and their stories, and the opportunity and the ability and the blessing to be able to accompany them as they live out their stories. And so that's why I ended up being a Presbyterian pastor. Thanks, Nancy.
Yeah, thank you, Eliana. Juan, you're next.
Thank you, Nancy, and hello, everyone. My name is Juan Sarmiento. You don't have to roll the R's if that's too difficult, but I'm the executive presbyter of the San Fernando Presbytery, which is a small presbytery in the northwest region of the Los Angeles area. And I was born in a country called Venezuela, south of the Caribbean Sea, kind of between the Andean mountains and the Amazon forest and all that good stuff, but was ordained in Brazil and became what my ordination was transferred to our church, the Presbyterian Church U.S.A, back in 2001. And since then, I've been serving in different capacities, new church development pastor, a solo pastor, community organizing, nonprofit work, and I have had the privilege of serving also on the staff with a Presbyterian Mission Agency, international related things. Some of the work of our church in partnership with people in about 80 countries. So I'm back to the place where I've lived the longest, Los Angeles, where my wife was born and our son was born. And I just delighted to be part of this conversation. We Latinos, Hispanics, Latinx are very much part of the story of this church. And we believe that we're all very much part of its future as well. So thank you for having us.
Thank you, Juan. Joanna.
Thank you, Nancy. Hello, everybody. Buenas tardes. My name is Joanna Kim. I am the Director of Ministry Services at Grace Presbytery, which is one of the presbyteries in Northeast Texas. It's not only confined to the Dallas-Fort Worth Metroplex, but in the surrounding areas. I am Korean. I was born in Korea, in South Korea, in Seoul. And when I was in first grade, my family moved to Argentina. So I grew up in Buenos Aires, Argentina, and my journey to the United States, although I am a third generation Presbyterian, was through international studies. And I came to this country as an international student. And it was during that time, after I finished my studies, on a trip to the borders between Mexico and Texas, and I was assisting a Presbyterian church with some translations and programming, that I received the call to switch my career, and I ended up pursuing a full-time ministries. And I believe that God has called me not simply to this presbytery's work after having served multicultural churches and the widest church in Grace Presbytery as well. My life and my ministry and my passion has been building bridges. And bridges has meant of all sorts, generationally, culturally, because that has been my own journey. I've been crossing bridges since I was a little child, and I believe that it was in that bridging experience that I also came to realize that the gifts that I can bring to the life of the church, but also to being gifted by the richness of who we are as a church and beyond the church. Thank you.
Thank you, Joanna. And Fernando.
Buenas tardes. My name is Fernando Rodríguez. I serve currently as Associate Presbyter for Mission out in Denver Presbytery. It's great to be with you all this evening. I've been a pastor now as of Monday. I've been ordained for 12 years in the PCUSA. I've already heard similar experiences. I was born and pretty much raised in the Roman Catholic Church. My mom to this day still is very Catholic. We have interesting conversations about that. But the Presbyterian experience that I had when I did join as a young adult, I had what we would call a Presbycostal experience. So I really didn't find out what it was to be Presbyterian until I got to seminary, which was quite an entertaining experience. So I've served in different capacities in these last 12 years. I've served urban, suburban churches, Latino, African-American, new, old, established, dying churches. And now I'm in a mid-council role that I never thought I would be in, but here we are. And I'm actually having a lot of fun doing it, which is really funny. Funny for me anyway. And what got me into ministry, a variety of things because God is a comedian, first of all. But second, I've always been intrigued by what it means to gather community, to be called to community and to gather community. I guess it was a sign when in my second, third grade years, all the friends of the neighborhood would gather in my front porch. So maybe that was God trying to tell me something. But yeah, I've always asked, that's been one of the guiding questions for me in ministry. Who is being gathered here? Who should be gathered here? Who isn't, and why? And how do we live in community together? So that's what keeps me here.
Great, thank you to all of you. The election of 7 Hispanic and Latinx leaders in mid-councils across the country outside of Puerto Rico is in many ways historic. What gifts do you bring to your ministry, given your unique identities? And how does your identity inform your work with the PCUSA and your ministry? And I will just open the floor to whoever would like to start, and please just jump in when you want to.
So I'm gonna throw a first volley out. I think something that you heard about the gifts we bring, I think we're all dreamers. We literally are dreamers. We believe that God's hope for the church and for each of us and the people we serve is far bigger than what the human church can see. So for me, I love making the impossible possible because of that belief system. So I think that's a gift that I would dare say we each bring in our own unique context. But one that I hold dear because I think that's why we don't give in to the exhaustion of despair, even when circumstances are despairing. We're resilient because we live between the here and the not yet. So we're even more comfortable being in this liminal post-pandemic place, and we've learned to live in those spaces in order to lean into God's call. So for me, I'll say that those realities, those gifts, along with love of people, the intersection of being second career, the intersection of loving what the church can be aspirationally, what we're called to be, I think is extraordinary. For me, I'm relational, gospel-centered, cross-cultural, believe in social justice. Those things make for our ministry in real and vibrant ways. So that's how I see it all intersecting. We're all cross-cultural. It's extraordinary. I'm very humbled by these 4 saints that I get to serve with and not to play with enough. So that's a little bit to start this, but we're dreamers, and I never thought of us that way until today.
Ruth, I think you're, as usual, so wise. I think that is a huge thing that I would concur with. I think the other piece for me is as people who are constantly straddling 2 worlds, 1 foot in a different culture, and even having to interpret not just languages, but social cues and cultural norms and all that. I think I've found it incredibly helpful in doing mid-council work, being able to come into a variety of different contexts and congregations and being able to interpret the Book of Order or our policies that we have in our presbytery for their context and for what they're living in. It's something that I've been doing ever since I was a child and had to translate for my parents. And then when we were living in Colombia, all of a sudden I was the gringa. And so I was translating my American experience in a Colombian context. And so going into different situations ministerially and trying to find a way or creating a way comes naturally. I think there's also a recognition that a lot of the work that we do as mid-council leaders, which is that interpretation of our polity, is the recognition that that polity was not written with people like us in mind. And so we understand that we always have to interrogate the polity. Although we are naturally rule followers, particularly those of us that have immigrated, that just comes with the territory. You don't want to break a rule, but we're also people that really want to massage that rule to make it work for everybody. Because if there's one thing that Latino and Latinx households know, is that that table is always expansive and everybody needs to have access. And so there may be rules, but we're going to find a way to make the rules work for us. And I think that comes inherently with being a leader with Latinx or Latino descendancy.
Yeah, Eliana hits on something about the ever expanding table. There's always rice in the pot. Siempre hay arroz en la olla for everyone. That's something it was easy to believe Jesus and multiplying of the bread and the fishes, because I saw my grandmother's pot give food to too many people throughout my life. And it never seemed to end, but that wasn't the question you guys asked. I echo, especially the whole two worlds thing. I was born in New Jersey, and I grew up in Puerto Rico, and I didn't become Presbyterian until as a young adult. And that it was a constant navigation. And even when I became Presbyterian, it was like I mentioned earlier, it was a Presbycostal experience. It wasn't the traditional Presbyterian thing. But what has kept me in is because at that church, I was allowed to see that I had a voice, and the voice was a part of the decision-making of the church. And that to me was very significant, that questions were allowed and encouraged about the church, about your faith. And then as I continued to grow in the faith, that social justice was not a thing on this side, but it was very much intertwined. And this has been said, is more of an echo of what has already been said, but having that voice and helping others see that voice in them has been very important for me in my ministry, for myself personally, but having others understand that they also have that voice, especially in the Latino context, where we do have, whether it's through faith practice or even culturally, perhaps a Roman Catholic understanding of faith, or at least the lens, the parting lens is a Roman Catholic one, right? Where it is the priests that have the voice, and all of a sudden people enter Presbyterian churches like, oh wait, I have a vote, I can be a part of this. And that does wonders for people's view of the world and of faith. So I having been kind of on the margins of a lot of different communities and having to fight for that voice and be included as part of is very important.
So Nancy, we didn't rehearse this, but this is how we really love each other and support one another, because we're building our thoughts into the other person. And I'm just picking up what Fernando said about the margins. The contribution to the life of this mid-council's work and the life of the churches and within the walls of the church and outside, I think, is the richness of our Hispanic, Latino, Latina culture. Is such a beautiful culture. And I think that not simply we personify this, we embody that difference, which our denomination confesses and preaches. So we bring the gift of the diversity that we hope that we are not simply reminded of in the printed versions, but that we confess not simply in a changing time. So that's, I think, that it's a huge gift to the life of the church. And again, as Fernando said, while being marginalized is something that we speak for awareness, so that we are not marginalizing those who are outside of the center, being in the margins and being able to see this life, these communities of faith from the margins, I think it adds the depth and the diversity that often is missed in the life of the church. And to be able to not simply articulate or advocate for our and with our congregations that are not as diverse as we wish they are, as our lives and our neighbors and our demographics are drastically changing in the different contexts. I think that that is the work that we can offer is both to challenge, but also to invite, to really step into a new reality of what a church ought to look like, sound like, but also confess our faith like.
Mhm. No, and I wanted to tag along with that. I think that confessing of our faith, I think Latinos for the most part are people of faith, and we bring, I believe, to this our church a life of faith that is vibrant. Call it Presbycostal or not, whether it is more sacramental in shape or say given to the intellect or the social justice movement. But there is a word, passion, paixão, they were saying in Brazil, but it is, I see that, and I think that can add to some of what we mean when we affirm that we're going to serve Christ with intelligence and energy, intelligence, imagination, and love. To what my colleagues have so well said, I want to add that perhaps the ability to cope with moments of great change. I mean, all of us, because of the circumstances of both the countries we come from or the communities where we come from, we are used to change, and some of us thrive in the midst of that. And I think for a church that probably finds itself more acquainted with order and stability than with moments like this that we're living, where there is a great deal of uncertainty about how things are going to look like. I think that combination of faith, a profound faith in God that has carried us throughout generations, that has been expressed in more recent movements, keep in mind, bear in mind that about 1/4 of all the Latino population in the U.S. Are Protestants. So we're very much part of this history. We're not coming at this anew. But that faith that has been very present, being in the Roman Catholic form or Protestant form, is important to us and prepares us for times of great change. So I think that is a gift to our church in these times of uncertainty, where structures are continually being changed, the shape of things, the configuration of things. We know that we've been there, done that, and we know how things turn out well at the end. So a sense of confidence, I think it's helpful. Not arrogance for sure, but humble confidence in the sovereignty of a God that loves the world and is faithful.
You know, you made me think of one last thing. I know we need to move on. Is something very invaluable. You can't lead a people that you don't love, and I know that everyone in this ministry believes that they love the people they're called to serve. You can't fool people with that, right? And I think that's something we all bring naturally in some way, this open of heart. And then the other thing that I don't think we talk enough about is we are the original, in our denomination, the word evangelical is not a bad word for us of Latino heritage. It's been misappropriated. But we do love Jesus, and that is the gospel. And so I love that we're not schizophrenic with this, right? We love Jesus and we believe Jesus teaches us to be a witness that cares for that which is broken in our midst. So I love that about something I think we bring organically to the church.
So in this particular pandemic moment, is there something that you grieve about your ministry? I think you've done such a great job in lifting up things that, you know, that you celebrate about your different perspectives and what you bring to the church. But are there things at this moment that you grieve?
Well, certainly, I mean, the fact that the people of color in our communities have been the most affected by this pandemic is something that moves us to a great sense of grief and probably re-examination of how we approach ministry and our sense of walking together with people that are different than probably what will represent the majority in our church. That is a great sense of grief. I think certainly, I mean, all of us in Mid-Council having accompanying churches of different types and that are facing the reality of being, so to speak, at the end of the rope. And it is extremely painful, I think, to see that. But I think more than that, I think probably what keeps me awake at night and is how are we being able to seize this moment in preparation for what is next, for a church that will be different and a church that will serve creatively and that will more fully engage with those at the margin. And will give voice to the voiceless or listen to the spirit voice through them. And my sense is, and it grieves me, is that at times our churches, all of us, tend to cling to a hope that is not necessarily the hope of the gospel, talking about being evangelical in the good sense. But it is the hope of our past, of the reconstruction of what was, and at times that deeply grieves me and makes me realize how much work we have ahead of us and how much we need God's Spirit to open our hearts to the new things that God is doing.
I couldn't agree more, Juan. There were two things that came to my mind when you asked that, Nancy. One of them is that I think one of the things that grieves me is in ministry is to see the church, and I'm speaking now just in my context, the Peace U.S.A. in the Pacific Northwest, specifically in Seattle. So many congregations unwilling or unable to reinvent or revision themselves, something that I think that's something that we've always thought that we all have to do as an immigrant and as a Latina. I've always, the word pivot has been used so much, overused, but Latinos are always pivoting. We're always having to pivot and reinvent. And it grieves my heart when I am working with a church or churches and that's not in their wheelhouse. They can't do it. And they would rather die than to be able to go through that motion. I think the second thing that grieves me is, it's always been said, ministry is lonely. Mid-council ministry is lonelier. And then add the layer to that, there's only, well, thank goodness, there's now 7 of us Latinos doing this work. It's very, very lonely. And, thank God that none of us are shy or, reticent to reach out to one another, but it can sometimes be a very lonely place to be and a reminder of how much still the institution of the church is rooted in the good old boys network. and that people all look a certain way or act a certain way. And then, we show up and, mocha en leche, we're the fly in the milk. And, it's a reminder. Do I belong? Am I supposed to be here? Do I fit? And it can be quite isolating sometimes.
So I'm going to piggyback on Eliana. My first meeting at a mid-council gathering, I came and I went upstairs and cried because I thought I was really well adjusted, but clearly not that well adjusted that day. And I went up to a friend who happened to be of Asian ancestry. And I feel like I stepped back 30 years. So the ice, it's just, it's symbolic of this space where mid-council work for anyone is hard, let me be clear. But when you have this longing to be in community, it just doesn't happen. It's a very isolating place. It feels at times that there are only 7 of us right now. It's not a celebration when you think of over 170 entities. It really is an existential challenge to how does this happen in 2021? That there are only 7 of us. So for me, that's something I grieve. I don't want to keep saying we're the first. It's 2021. We should be beyond that. So that's something I grieve, along with the grief that I think Eliana has said so well, of the shifting paradigm that requires that we, with grace, challenge our communities to consider reinvesting that which is no longer, to allow for something new that can evolve, that will not look like what they look like, with their buildings, with their dollars. But I'm hopeful too, but I do grieve that. I grieve the invisibility cloak that at times we're not seen. And that's very painful.
Thank you for that thoughtful question, Nancy, and to Juan, Eliana, and Ruth sharing your thoughts. Personally, this COVID or the pandemic has affected me very heavily because my family is in Argentina. Most of them, they live either in Buenos Aires and Córdoba, and the ports are closed, including my mother who lives in Córdoba. So this sense of longing for home, which I never took granted, being away from home, has deepened very, very intensely. And the idea that I am not able to travel to see my mother, or for her to come and see me here with the siblings who live in the States, that has been very saddening. So living in this away from your loved one has affected me quite a bit. For specifically, without overgeneralizing, the grief for our immigrant congregations, and especially the Hispanic, Latino American churches in my context, immigrant churches are not simply a faith community of the ones who live close in the neighborhood of the church. They travel the extra mile to be part of that faith community, of that congregation. And I think that even with the reopening, measured reopening, because of so many restrictions happening, the return of those who were driving the extra mile, or the ones who truly enjoy the fellowship aspect of the immigrant community's connections, because we're with our people, right? All of the restrictions that signified in the life of the congregation really also resulted in a double distancing. One for safety reasons, but also the emotional detachment. And I think that has affected the churches, and seeing our congregations here, really having a harder time in recovering really in relationship to the traditionally wide angle churches based on a community membership. I think that has been very concerning. And the third grief that I have, which is not simply the Zoom fatigue, when we are in person, the lack of diversity and inclusion, it's much more salient. You can spell it out. You can see that because people are together. They're in the same space. So both the diversity of how we sound differently or how we look differently, when we lack that, we can pinpoint that. But on a Zoom, it's another square, another face, another name. The ones who are shy, I see our Hispano-American constituents who are serving in our structures and the committees, and it's taken so much effort to include them to the table. Some of them because of language differences. One is because our structural committees meet on a weekday at 2:00. Many of our Hispano members have a full-time job at that time. So that has alienated, and we have become so laser focused and keeping our Zoom meetings into the 60 minutes, that really alienates the ones who are already marginalized. So when we don't see these faces, when we don't hear their voices, that deficiency is harder to pick up on a Zoom virtual gathering. And that concerns me also. I grieve about what, at least in my context, we try so hard towards, and it's almost like because of the pandemic, that has dissipated, but people are not addressing it as we should.
Yeah, I really don't have much to add to what everyone has already said. I do wonder, though, that if what we're grieving, what I'm grieving, and I think my colleagues would agree, this didn't necessarily start with the pandemic. If anything, it was the differences, the marginalization, the lack of representation. It's made it worse. And about the comment, I think it was Eliana that mentioned about the ability or inability to pivot. I grieve not having the eyes to see. Many congregations not having the eyes to see the reasons why their churches are dwindling. When you go into a place, 5 year, it'd be spaces of 5-10 years, and you see the same exact people, but maybe less, you start to wonder, right? And this is made worse by the pandemic, of course. So then you start wondering, the biggest portion of our membership overall as a denomination are from churches that are 1,000 members, whatever the statistic is, right? But yet the majority of the churches are the smaller ones. So how can we get the smaller churches to think nimbly, think in a way that can pivot, can adjust to these realities? And I think in that aspect, we have a lot to learn from the resiliency. And I know that word has been used a lot and sometimes too much, but of Latino Hispanic immigrant churches, because we are kind of used to it, to be the need to adjust and readjust and to make hacer de tripas corazones. Y'all go ahead with that translation. To make a lot out of just a little bit. I think there are lessons to be learned for the greater church in those communities.
So how can we ensure that the stories, the history of Hispanic and Latinx Presbyterians are preserved and shared?
Ooh, I like this question. I think that the first one is don't wait for Hispanic Latino month to roll around to highlight Latino leadership or Latino Presbyterians. We're here 12 months out of the year, pretty much every day. So I would love for Latino Presbyterians to be highlighted year round, and not just to make the covers of certain publications look more multicultural, but to actually delve into the ministry and the work that's being done by them. I think the other thing that would help also is, in many ways, our denomination is still East Coast centric, and there's so much going on west of the Mississippi, and a lot of powerful leadership development and witness to the gospel happening. And everything seems to be congregated on the other side of the country. There's a lot of really good stories, but they just don't seem to get the airplay. They don't seem to make the front page of the denominational website or other publications. And it'd be great to have them highlighted at other times of the year as well.
And to add to what Eliana said, just building on that, I mean, there are even categories of possibilities of theologians, right, that are scholars, that are giving thought to the church. How wonderful to let their stories be told. Because of my decade in California, I really am an infused creature, and I'm aware of the extraordinary energy that is in west of the Mississippi. Stories that I had no clue about until I raised my son out in California, right? Stories that have shaped who I've become, even as I sojourn on the East Coast. So I think we can, I don't know, something so simple like getting our stories out there. Just these folks are resources for stories of grace and possibility from Texas, Denver, California, Washington. So helping get those stories would really be invaluable to the denomination, because we don't get on PMA, Presbyterian News Service or Presbyterian Outlook. So let me just name a few. It would be great. We've got
One thing you're doing tonight is providing interpretation. Languages matter to us a lot. And at the same time, not all Hispanos and Latinos, we're all from the same, we're all very different, but we get lumped up very easily. While other racial ethnic groups, even within the denomination, sometimes they're highlighted for the uniqueness. My hope and prayer is that our Hispano, Hispanic, Hispanas, Latina, Latinx communities will be treasured for who we are and not just as a single identity. And I think that will bring the richness. And I also think that it will be very important for our children who are Hispanic, Latinx Americans to see that the denominational church is invested in an intentional way in sharing our stories, so that those who are growing up already in that differentiated world, they also see that. But the hope is that the one who is not one of our children, they would also see our next generation to be a rich community that brings not simply the diversity of our own identities, but this is truly the kingdom of God. And this is exactly what we are ought to celebrate. So this to say, I hope that this is a generational effort and an intentional effort that does not stop, because with our own generation, and that we invest into doing that. And I myself, I didn't introduce, but I am on the board of the Presbyterian Historical Society. So living it out and acting on these words will be very important, and the continued support of the leaders on this Zoom And those of you who are watching this, any of the creative, non-creative, any ideas and voices, if those can be shared with our Presbyterian Historical Society, I think that we would have to count on that source of voices and ideas instead of just on the other side coming up with the solutions to the problems that we've been dealing for so many years.
Well, Fernando, go ahead.
The concept of nuance is the one that rings loudest for me. The ability to, that in our story, the nuance is captured. It's been mentioned. I mean, we are 21 plus countries or lineages, if you will, that are bunched up into Hispanic, Latino, Latina, Latinx, even the terms that are used to identify who we are as a people shows the constant struggle that we are as a people in this country in particular. So I think that is necessary, to be clear. I believe that is necessary, that the terms used are a constant negotiation and struggle, but that the stories capture that we are not the ones that simply, we didn't arrive from wherever country yesterday necessarily. Yes, we have, and we've been here for a while, and we have been part of this greater fabric for a longer time. It's both and. So to highlight that, the in between this, the nuance of who we are as a people would be pivotal when telling and retelling and capturing our stories.
Well, and something I would add is, when we talk about Presbyterian history in these times of appropriately critical observations about our colonial past as Presbyterians, we could throw, so to speak, the baby with the bathwater. And I would say that our Presbyterian ancestors will be very happy, thrilled that there is a conversation like this happening today. Zoom wouldn't be in their understanding of things, but if Zoom existed, I think they will be very happy to know that we were having this conversation. So I think there are elements of our Reformed Presbyterian identity, the history of who we are in these lands, and that could be lifted up. I'm reminded of, for instance, of the fact that yesterday was Jonathan Edwards' birthday. I don't know how many of you would think that that's worth celebrating or lamenting, but I would say that in the Latin American community, there's a lot of people that look up to someone like Jonathan Edwards as an influential theologian in the formation of the American religion. I mean, certainly we need to engage with the past critically, but there is an openness to engaging at those levels. At the fact that there was a Protestant Spanish Bible before there was a King James Bible. Elements, the reality of the mixed hybrid mestizo element of our Latinidad, of our Latin people, where we do have a great commonality, and our shared heritage does come from the natives people, the First Nations of this Western Hemisphere. Yes, history can be ambiguous, but I do believe that history can also be is still being written. And I commend you, Nancy, for taking this initiative. I commend our General Assembly agencies for emphasizing translation. I do hope, and this is probably something that the Presbyterian History Society can help us with. I know translation can take a lot of effort, but we're a community of people. We could go at this together, and we can share the load of translation and be able to tell our story, our joint story to future generations. So I personally, as a Presbytery exec, I would love to see more collaboration in that sense, because that's the only way we can invite other people into this story. Flawed and certainly far from perfect, but one that continues to be unfolded.
So we have about 10 minutes for questions. And Natalie, do you want to lift up several questions that have appeared in the chat?
Sure. So it doesn't look like we have questions yet, but there are several comments that have been made in the chat. So if anyone would like to ask a question, you should be able to use the Q&A feature. So click on that to ask a question. And I'll give everyone a moment to do that, and I can read some of the comments that were made. Ken Ross said, our Native American congregations are forming intergenerational storytelling groups in their indigenous languages. The stories get lost because they are not written down. So the importance of oral histories to ensure that those histories are not lost. Okay.
So that would be an interesting project, in that both West Coast and East Coast and the Southwest have long stories that could have been lost in records, right? You know, I'm thinking about the Hispanic Church in New York City. It was predominantly Puerto Rican, pastored by Cuban diaspora. That our pastors were Cuban as a kid. And those stories, we each have unique stories of, I was on the West Coast when the first woman was ordained in Southern California of Hispanic, Margarita Reyes. We had a party, I was EP, and it was a standing ovation. I was crying. The Presbytery almost had to carry me out with oxygen. But we have these brilliant stories that have gotten lost somehow.
We did just get one question. Sorry, go ahead, Fernando.
Just real quick on the and I really appreciated the comment about that, how stories are lost because they're not written in paper. And that goes to show the importance of how to access these stories, because many of our stories aren't. I've pastored and I've been in connection with several Hispanic and Presbyterian churches, and we're known for record keeping. I know we're talking about the Historical Society here, so you can cover your ears if you don't want to hear this. But I mean, the reality is that in many instances, that's not the first thing we think about, filing these things in minutes and papers and all of that. Yet these are congregations and faith expressions in local contexts that have a rich history. And unfortunately, well, I mean, because of just the nature of things, the elders of these churches are dying away. So how do we capture these stories is going to be a lot more, going to require taking steps a little bit beyond minute taking and written records, etc. It's going to have to be really going into these communities and listening to these.
I can't help but see in the Q&A, there's a question from Ricardo Moreno. Ricardo, gusto de verte, oírte.
I
know. He asked about the Presbyterians in Latin America, and I'm someone who grew up hearing about the Presbyterians in Colombia and its small but very powerful presence ecclesially in Colombia, these crazy Presbyterians who are so committed to social justice. I think one of the things that we can do in celebrating that history is to bring about or attempt to do a full circle. Here in the Presbytery of Seattle, serendipitously, because I did not lead it, I did not want to be the one to lead it, but we have established a partnership with a presbytery in Colombia, with the Presbyterian Church of Colombia. And it has been intentionally set up, we structured it, we have a covenant of agreement and all that, that is the antithesis to what the colonization of the Protestant church was in Latin America. So we base this new partnership, or hermandad, this siblinghood, based on mutuality. And what do we have that we each other can share, how we can accompany each other in our ministries, in the call that God has put on our lives. And I think that is a very powerful way of retelling and reinterpreting the history of the Presbyterian Church in Latin America, is how do we revisit those relationships and how do we reconcile some of the woundedness that came out of it, but also celebrate the incredible gifts that came out of it as well. And recapturing that, I think, is a way to celebrate it and to remember both the history that has been and also what is yet to be.
And we have one more question also from Ricardo in the Q&A, asking what basic stuff of the history of the Presbyterian Latino churches are preserved at PHS, El Caucus de la Raza, or the National Latino Caucus, the result of the fusion of a Southwest and East Coast entity. I guess that's a question for Nancy or me.
I'll just say that we have not preserved enough, and we definitely know that. And we have been talking about being more intentional over the last couple of years, and Joanna has, as a member of our board, and Ruth on the advisory council of PHS, have been really good ambassadors for helping us make inroads into figuring out how to do a better job of collecting these stories and these histories. But it is definitely a work in progress, and we welcome input. We welcome people to help us. We are a relatively small staff, and we depend on Presbyterians out in the field, as it were, to help us really to even think about how to sometimes collect this history, as you all have alluded to, with thinking about oral history, but also just putting the call out there for stories and history, and then helping people bring that history in whatever form it's in into the archives. So it's a project that we very much want to make more progress with.
Just to piggyback on what Nancy was sharing, and not simply just to wear the other hat, I think it could be very important for those of us who are participating on this panel, but also those of you who are listening to us, to invite Presbyterian Historical Society to your Presbytery gatherings. Have your folks to meet PHS. I think that, and if the Presbyterian Historical Society, we were to develop some sort of a visual that will highlight the Hispanic Latinx heritage, and beyond that, I think that the increased visibility will strengthen the relationship so we can build our resources. And I think that that's where we can be intentional about how do we build a relationship from a mid-council to an agency or to this organization, and what does that? So, and I think that unless we do that actively, we're not gonna be as effective in identifying how we can be better resource and how we're gonna reach to our pew members at both ends, not only the Hispanic Latinx congregants, but also the ones that otherwise will not find these treasures that are hidden in our hearts, but also within us.
I was thinking that for me, this is very personal in that my dad was an elder who became a Presbyterian minister in New York City. I don't want his story to be lost. That story is a story of courage, of sacrifice, of building bridges. And I just think we're being lost. You know, I love Ken Ross's imagery. Stories that are sung and danced are remembered but we still have to identify where the music is coming from, so that we can share that story in that dance. So for me, this has become personal in a way that I did not understand until recently. So I'm grateful for the opportunity, Joanna, so echoing your charge and call out.
Well, I want to thank all of you, all 5 of our panelists, for leading us today in this discussion and lifting up so many things for us to think about and to go forward with. I also want to thank the interpreters from Global Language Resources. That's a part of the Administrative Services Group of the PC-USA, and we are very happy that they were able to join us today. Please reach out to the Presbyterian Historical Society, either directly or through some of your mid-council leaders or other people in the church if you want us to work with you to collect the stories and history that I think you heard so much about today, and that we will be so much richer for in the future if those come into and are part of this archive of this time and how we use the past in order to really move forward. So thank you very much. I appreciate you joining us tonight.
Gracias,
Thank you
Nancy.
very much.
Bye.
Thank you.
Blessings.